About. We're down a little bit, obviously, because of the weather. I'm sure some of the roads in the county are probably treacherous, but we're glad to be able to be together to study, and we're thankful for your presence and those that might be able to view us in the live stream. We continue our study of the life of Christ. This is our second quarter, as we've been reminding everybody, but you probably don't need a reminder of that if you've been in the class. We are in the periods of retirement, and we are in the third and heading into the fourth period of retirement. These periods are important in the ministry of Jesus as he gets away from the hustle and bustle of the kind of ministry that he's been doing, a lot of teaching and healing, still doing some of that, but he's drawing his apostles away with him at times. It seems like they're learning special lessons and having valuable exchanges and teaching moments with Jesus during this time as he begins to prepare them for what's coming relative to his death and resurrection. That's beginning to come up in some of the accounts as well, as we'll see. But all of this then in the periods of retirement is particularly aimed, it seems to me, at the training of the 12. The first retirement period started out with that. The 12 returned from the limited commission. Jesus tried to go away with them for some solitude, but the multitudes followed, and it wound up with the feeding of the 5,000 and Jesus walking on the water. Long talk with the crowds in the synagogue at Capernaum, but a lot of them turned back and didn't walk with him anymore after his demands about his expectation, I should say, for them to take him into their lives. The second retirement period was a journey to Tyre and Sidon and the healing of the Syrophoenician woman's daughter. We'll look at that just briefly again in a moment. And then the third period of retirement really starts with the healing of the deaf man's speech impediment, the feeding of the 5,000, of the 4,000 rather, and a discussion with the Pharisees and Sadducees. So we're in lesson 5. We have this overview of it, review of the second and third retirements, which we'll get into in just a second. Then we'll talk about the feeding of the 5,000 and the controversy with the Pharisees. The text that we'll be looking at is Matthew 15 and 16, or Mark 7 and Mark 8 is where we'll be tonight. Not as much Bible text to cover this evening, but some interesting stories and I think some information that'll help fill out and explain some of the things that are going on. We talked in the last class, toward the end of the class, about Jesus healing a Gentile woman's daughter in the area of Tyre. Mark says that Jesus withdrew from Galilee to the region of Tyre seeking seclusion. He entered a house and wanted no one to know it, but he could not be hidden. And so Tyre is way up there on the Mediterranean coast, pretty far from where he's been doing almost all of his work up till now, around Galilee and the Decapolis. According to Matthew's account, Jesus went to the region of Tyre and Sidon. Interestingly, Mark only talks about him leaving the region of Tyre and Sidon. He goes to Tyre, he leaves the region of Tyre and Sidon, but Matthew describes him going to the region of Tyre and Sidon. So that's a pretty expansive area. Here you see the Sea of Galilee where he has been. There is Tyre, there is Sidon. So there's some kind of good chance that he was doing some traveling around all of that area. It appears perhaps that the house that the healing was in Tyre itself. And I want to go back and look at that healing just briefly by way of review, but also to add a couple of things to what we discussed in our last class period. You have in Mark chapter 7 this woman whose daughter is demon-possessed, and she comes to Jesus to beg him to heal her daughter. The woman was, Mark says, a Greek of non-Jewish culture, obviously, and of Syrophoenician ancestry. Matthew calls her a woman of Canaan, which is, I think, the only time the word Canaan is used in that way in the New Testament to describe the Old Testament land of Canaan. You have one of the disciples of Jesus that is Simon the Canaanite, but that's a different word. It refers to him, it means a zealot. He was so it's a completely different word, really. But here she's referred to as a woman of Canaan. So that takes us back to some Old Testament, a lot of Old Testament time with the people who inhabited the land before the Israelites did, and some of the difficulties that Israel had with them all along. So she's all of that. She's a Greek culture, Syrophoenician ancestry. The Syrians and the Phoenicians inhabited this land. She's called a person of Canaan. All of that fits her very well. So she comes requesting that Jesus heal her daughter. Jesus responds, "Let the children be filled first, for it's not good to take the children's bread and throw it to the little dogs." And here he's just saying he was, sent to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. She is not that. His first responsibility is to them and not to those who are Gentiles or outsiders. But the woman doesn't take offense at that. She says, "Even the little dogs under the table eat from the children's crumbs." She's undeterred. And Jesus says in Mark's account that for that saying, the demon was taken out of her daughter. In Matthew's account, which I didn't mention the other night, Matthew has Jesus also saying, "Great is your faith, let it be to you as you desire." So I just heard a good sermon on this from Greg Chandler, and he made a couple of points that's why one of the reasons I'm going over this, that were I thought very helpful. In Matthew's account particularly, there are a couple of things that come to the fore. Twice she calls him Lord, and once she calls him Lord, the Son of David. What's unusual about that for the kind of person that she was, calling him the Son of David? She's not an Israelite. How would that mean anything to her? So what does that tell us? Maybe we don't know enough of the story about how she came to that knowledge, right? But for that to be significant to her, to call Jesus the Son of David, which we know is really a moniker for the Christ to come. The Christ was to be the Son of David, the Messiah. That's the one the Jews were looking for, the Samaritans were looking for, as we've already seen in John chapter 4. And here's a Syrophoenician Canaanite woman who's looking for the Son of David and identifies Jesus as that one, the Messiah. So that's pretty interesting. When Jesus says, "Great is your faith," I'm fairly confident that her reference to him as the Son of David is part of the exhibition of her faith. Okay? So he sees faith there. But tell me, where else might he see faith in her? Why is her faith great? What's great about it? Right, she had confidence that he could heal her daughter. So she comes with that. Was it just a little bit of confidence or a lot of confidence? What do you think? How can we tell? Seemed to be a lot. Was she going to give up easily and say, "Well, maybe you can't heal her anyway"? She doesn't do that, right? She's persistent. Okay, and we mentioned that the other night too as well, or other morning, I should say. Great humility. Shows a lot of humility. A lot of people, sadly, a lot of us probably, self-included, when we get our pride hurt a little bit, we shrink back and we don't want to go forward in things, in our pursuits. Maybe they're good pursuits, but we get our pride hurt a little bit, and so we sull up, and we get sad and mad and everything else, and we won't go forward in our faith sometimes. That didn't happen to this woman, did it? She wasn't going to let that stop her. So we see a number of things about her that demonstrate great faith. The woman goes home and finds her daughter healed. We also noticed in the last lesson Jesus healing a deaf man, and I'm not going to go through all of that, but I do want to remind you of the first fact on the chart. This is found in Mark 7, verses 31 through 37. Jesus heals this deaf man, but prior to it, he traveled through the middle of the Decapolis. The middle of the Decapolis, Mark 7 and verse 31. That's going to be kind of the second retirement into the third retirement period where he's getting away a bit. because that's not the normal area where he's ministering. We'll talk about the Decapolis more a little bit later, but he does come across this deaf man, heals him, takes him out and puts his fingers in his ears, spat and touched his tongue, and says, "Be open." And immediately the man's ears were open and he could speak plainly. He was healed immediately. And we're impressed with Jesus' ability to heal immediately, virtually always. The people, when they see the miracle and see all that Jesus is doing, say he has done all things well. So that gets us then into some new material this evening. We're going to start now in Mark chapter 8. In those days, the multitude being very great, having nothing to eat, Jesus called his disciples to them and said, "I have compassion on the multitude because they've now continued with me 3 days and have nothing to eat. If I send them away hungry to their own houses, they will faint on the way, for some of them have come from afar." This miracle, which will be the feeding of the 5,000, occurs near the Sea of Galilee, almost certainly on the eastern shore. Jesus had gone through Decapolis. He's still on that side, apparently. The multitudes are following him again, a large crowd, a lot of people. As it was in the feeding of the 5,000, the difference here is the length of time that they continue with Jesus. How long do they follow him? 3 days. 3 days. And they don't have sufficient provisions with them. Jesus is concerned that they're fainting on the way. He's concerned that they've come from afar and don't have the ability to get provisions. As we mentioned, that side of the Sea of Galilee, of course, the King's Highway is not very far from there. There's a lot of travelers. But people were coming, as the Gospels have already said, from all of the regions around just to be with Jesus. They'll make special trips, up from Judea, from Idumea, from Samaria. All of those places have been mentioned already, as well as the far reaches of Galilee itself. So people coming from all over the place, from afar, as Jesus says it. And Jesus is concerned about them. He has compassion on the multitude. They continued 3 days. This is another example of what Jesus does not do to draw crowds of people. He doesn't give them food to draw big crowds. He doesn't tempt them, or, if you will, draw them with, worldly things, with carnal things. He doesn't do that. I know that's what a lot of religious people think we ought to be doing, but he doesn't do that. He draws people with his teaching and with miracles. And as we've talked about several times already, when we've talked about the miracles and the signs, the point of those wasn't really that he was meeting human needs, but that he was doing what he was doing supernaturally. The sign itself, that it was supernatural, that it was something that only God could do, that was what's significant about the miracles. Yes, he was meeting human needs. Yes, he had compassion on people, but that wasn't the main thing. And when people followed him for the bread instead of for the miracle, what did he tell them in our last class? Do not labor for the food that perishes, but for the food that endures to eternal life, right? Don't follow me for the food that perishes. You didn't follow me you should be following me for the sign and not for the food. And they need to be able to distinguish that, and so do we. So this is not justification for trying to evangelize by giving people things. There's a saying that is popular among some religious groups, even among some brethren, that benevolence, see what you think about this, benevolence, they say, is evangelism. Benevolence is evangelism. Is that right? That's not right. We, as individuals, we do good works before men so they can see them and glorify our Father who's in heaven. That's biblical. But there's not a place in Scripture anywhere where people were given things to bring them to Jesus, given things to bring them to Jesus. That's not done. Benevolence is never evangelism in Scripture, but it's been made to be. The disciples on this occasion, similar to the feeding of the 5,000, asked the question in verse 4, how can one satisfy these people with bread here in the wilderness? Now, it hadn't been all that long ago, if you think about it. It couldn't have been, but maybe just a couple of months ago, that he'd fed the 5,000. They should have had a clue already, right, about how this could be done. But they asked the question. Jesus gets more to the point on this occasion. It seems to me that this goes more straightforwardly. When he says in verse 5, how many loaves do you have? They say 7. And Matthew's account mentions that there are a few small fish as well. There is, just by way of passing interest, there's a sardine that is indigenous to the Sea of Galilee, and it's still fished today there, but has been fished there for thousands of years. And people conjecture that the few small fish may have been some of the sardines that come out of the lake, which is probable, I suppose, but that's conjecture as to what they were exactly. Somebody just might have had a bad day fishing and not caught the big ones, right? They just caught the little ones, whichever. So they have the 7 loaves and a few fish. And Jesus gives thanks for that. And they set the food before the multitude. The multitude has their fill to eat, and there's some left over. As we noticed with the feeding of the 5,000, Jesus gives thanks. And I've always think that's amazing how many times he does that. As the creator of everything and the giver of all, he himself is thankful for what he receives. He gives thanks to his Father, who was a part of the creation and the giving of all things. But he's thankful in heart. He's humble in heart. He's meek and lowly in heart. And if these attributes could be the attributes of the Son of God and were the attributes of the Son of God, they ought to be ours as well. We think about what a ideal human being Jesus is and was, and he is our perfect example in so many ways. But his thankfulness stands out to me for those reasons. It would be easy to say, well, he didn't have to be thankful. No, but he was thankful. He was thankful. And he's our example in those things as well. How many baskets were left over when they finished all that? 7 large. You remember how many were left over at the feeding of the 5,000? 12, right. 12 baskets. So 7 large baskets. What's significant about that? Again, the whole sign, the whole miracle itself, just let's get our minds around that. You got all these people out in the wilderness. As the disciples recognize, Jesus recognizes, the people recognize, they're getting really hungry, they're fainting on the way, and yet there's no food nearby. Some of them would have a long way to go to even begin to get food. And it's a problem then that humans could not normally solve. It's not going to be something that you can just snap your fingers or send everybody to McDonald's or whatever it is and get that taken care of. It's not going to happen that way. It cannot happen that way. And so here's a need, a human need that humans cannot meet. And Jesus meets it. And does he meet it just kind of, sort of? Maybe somebody will have just a little bit to eat. Everybody get a bite off of a piece of bread and you won't be quite so hungry. Is that how it works? They're filled to, they can't eat anymore, and there's 7 baskets overflowing. So that's how God meets needs. Jesus said, I've come that you may have life and have it more abundantly, but he wasn't talking about bread. He was talking about fulfilling our spiritual needs. And just as he could do that with physical needs in the feeding of the 5,000, the feeding of the 4,000, he can do it with our spiritual needs as well. What he has to give is filled to overflowing. What did David say in the 23rd Psalm? My cup runs over. My cup runs over. So that's how God takes care of things. That's what God can do for us. Fill us to overflowing. Such a impressive miracle in so many different ways. Any other thoughts or comments on that? All right, we're going to go on, and Jesus and his disciples travel back across the sea in the boat to the region of Dalmanutha, is what Mark says. Matthew has the region of Magdala. Well, Dalmanutha and Magdala are not exactly the same place, but they are very close, probably just a few hundred yards or no more than 1,000 yards away from each other. But they're on this western shore of the Sea of Galilee. That's a picture of Magdala there that I took from a boat when we were on the Sea of Galilee. I think I've shown that to you before, but that's that side. So it's not really specified where they go, but it's this general area, the region of Dalmanutha or Magdala. And as we mentioned in passing before and talking about Magdala, that would be where Mary Magdalene would be from. That's no doubt why she's so named. In any case, you have in Mark 8 and verse 10 that occurring, and then the Pharisees come out and begin to dispute with him, seeking from him a sign from heaven and testing him. In Mark's account, Jesus sighs deeply in his spirit, and he says, "Why does this generation seek a sign? Assuredly I say to you, no sign shall be given to this generation." So Mark doesn't really give us the entirety of Jesus' response. Matthew gives us more of it. So we're looking at Mark's account first, and it's abbreviated. It doesn't give us everything that Matthew's does. We'll look at that some more in a minute. But what do you take away from this, just reading Mark? The Pharisees here are demanding a sign because Jesus hadn't performed any signs, had he? I mean, what are they doing? They're testing him. He is somewhat exasperated, I think, the way Mark expresses it. He sighs deeply. Why do you think? And he'd already showed them a lot of signs. Were they going to accept that? They're going to see the signs and accept right away, right? That he's divine? No, they're not. It wouldn't matter, and that's going to come up in Matthew's account a little bit more fully. But it wouldn't matter, and so Mark just leaves it with Jesus saying, "No sign shall be given to this generation," as if he had given them He's given them all kinds of signs, but not one that they'd accept. Not one that they'd accept. Not one that they'd value. And you talk about throwing things to the dogs. People who don't appreciate what they've been given, God's not going to give them more of it. And that's just kind of a general principle. So let's look at what Matthew has to say about this in Matthew chapter 16. Let me go over there. Matthew does give us quite a few more details. He has both the Pharisees and Sadducees coming and testing him and asking him if he would show them a sign from heaven. That's Matthew 16 and verse 1. Somebody tell me what's unusual about that. Just the Pharisees and Sadducees. They didn't believe alike. Did they typically just do things together anyway? No. They were not mortal enemies by any means, but they didn't get along at all, and they liked to fuss and fight, and they didn't work together typically. They had to on the Sanhedrin court and the council. So there were Pharisees and Sadducees there, but a lot of times they didn't work together. If they had a common enemy, they would, and you see that here. They both had a vested interest in keeping power. I think the Pharisees wanted their spiritual hold on the people with their traditions, and the Sadducees wanted the political hold on the people because they had control of the high council and of the high priesthood and really of the temple grounds during Jesus' day. So they were both concerned about some teacher, some young rabbi coming along and stealing a lot of their support from the masses. And I'm sure that's what's driving their concern. So let's look at how Jesus answers them more fully in Matthew's account. Jesus answered and said to them, when it's evening, you say, it will be fair weather, for the sky is red. In the morning, it will be foul weather today, for the sky is red and threatening. Hypocrites! You know how to discern the face of the sky, but you cannot discern the signs of the times. A wicked and adulterous generation seeks after a sign. No sign shall be given to it except the sign of the prophet Jonah. And he left them and departed. So that's quite a bit more information than what Mark had given us, which is good and fine either way. But this, I think, is interesting. They'd seen a lot of signs already, hadn't they? They couldn't discern them. They could discern signs, they thought, of a weather forecast, right? So if the sky was red in what time of day? If the sky was red in the morning, it'll be bad weather. If in the evening the sky is red, it's fair weather. If you're in Israel, what are you looking at in the morning? Which way are you looking to see the sky? East, toward from where they're standing, say the Decapolis or across the Jordan. Where you're looking in the evening? West, because the sun's setting. So if you have a red sky in the west, it means something. If you have a red sky in the east, it means something else. If you have a red sky in the east, if you're in Israel, it means you've got a lot of moisture over you already. Okay, and you're going to have some bad weather probably the next day. If it's out east, it's over the Mediterranean, and it's liable to stay there. If it's out west, it's over the Mediterranean, and it's liable to stay there. So that was not necessarily a bad way of forecasting the weather. It was probably as good as what Brad Travis does on WAFF, but nonetheless, it was a way of discerning what the weather might be. And they held to that, I suppose, in some way. And it, as I said, had probably as much accuracy as some of our forecasts today. Yeah. Sailor's delight. Yeah, my mom used to say that. Yeah. So, and they probably got that from this, I would suspect. But he says a wicked and adulterous generation seeks after a sign. And no sign will be given. But here he says, except the sign of the prophet Jonah. Now, Jesus said earlier, talked about the sign of the prophet Jonah in Matthew chapter 12, and kind of explained what he meant by that. So we don't have to guess. If we only had Matthew 16, we'd have to guess what he means by that. But we don't have to guess, because we have Matthew 12 and verses 38 through 40, where again the scribes and Pharisees had come to him, and they were asking for a sign on that occasion. And he said basically the same thing: an evil and adulterous generation seeks for a sign. No sign will be given except the sign of the prophet Jonah. Then he explains it. For as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the great fish, so will the Son of Man be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. They're prophesying of his resurrection, and that would be the sign that would still be given, of course, to all men. Jesus is performing signs all the time, and he would still perform signs going forward, signs that some of the Pharisees and the Sadducees would actually witness, but would not accept. And he's well within the mark, obviously, when he describes these people as being an evil and adulterous generation, a wicked and adulterous generation, for their unwillingness to acknowledge divine power when they saw it, and when deep down in their hearts they had to know that the power was from God that was working these miracles. Could easily have been. Now, on this occasion, it seems that some have come up from Jerusalem. But again, very likely some of the same people. As we studied, when you might remember when we were in the intertestamental period, the years of silence, we talked about the origin of the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and there really weren't that many of them. More than a few, but not more than a few thousand. And the leaders of them were seemingly small in number. So could well be. I want to spend the last few minutes. Yeah, I'm sorry, Daniel. Go ahead.
Looking at how the Pharisees and Sadducees interacting, it's kind of an exercise in confirmation bias. When they're asking him this, it's not that they see what like to catch him when so that they can.
Yeah.
Even further than it being ridiculous and pressing. Respectful to them, to us, they want to catch it.
Right.
They want to be reaffirmed.
Right. So they're very disingenuous and hypocritical. And as you use the word confirmation bias, that's what they're wanting. They're wanting Jesus, whatever he says or does, they'll find some fault with it so that it will confirm what their idea that he's false teacher, false Messiah, and all this kind of stuff. And we need to be very careful that we don't operate that way in the world generally. But certainly these people were over the top in doing exactly that and approaching him in this way for that purpose. And I think that's a good observation, Daniel. And kind of is getting to the next thing I want to talk about. I want to talk about that word hypocrite for the remainder of our time, because that's what Jesus calls them. And kind of what Daniel is saying leads right into that they were extremely disingenuous with what they were doing. They obviously didn't really want a sign. They weren't going to believe any signs that Jesus did. It didn't matter what he did. He has done some incredible things, right? Just mind-blowing things he's done before some of these very same people. They didn't accept that. What's he going to do? Raise somebody from the dead? Whoops, he's already done that. What do they expect him to do? Walk on water? Oops, he's already done that. It's like, what are you going to do for people with that much prejudice and hypocrisy? So I want to think about this word hypocrisy with you and help think about how the people of that day really got what Jesus was saying when he called somebody hypocrite. Hypocrite literally is an actor in a play, someone pretending to be someone that they're not. It comes from a Greek word, which is basically hypocrite. Hippocrates is maybe how you'd say it if you're trying to pronounce the Greek, but it's basically hypocrite's the same word. They should bring it into English. And Thayer's Greek lexicon defines that as an actor, a stage player, and so thus a dissembler, a pretender, or a hypocrite. So that's the origin and the meaning of the word as Jesus uses it. So it's a person who claims or pretends to have certain beliefs about what is right, but who behaves in a way that disagrees with those beliefs. So they don't practice what they preach. In and around Galilee and the Decapolis in the first century, there were literal play actors, hypocrites, that were commonly seen in the theaters of the 10 cities of the Decapolis. You might remember Jesus has just gone through the Decapolis. Every one of the cities of the Decapolis had a Greek theater in it. Some of them had 2. And so these things were going on right under the noses of all of the Jewish people. Now, I'm not saying that all of the Jewish people were involved in that or would go see these shows. Probably a lot of them wouldn't, because it was countercultural for them. Those things were there for the Greeks, or for those who were, Greek culture. There weren't really a lot of true Greeks around anymore. But when we talked about the Decapolis, we mentioned that these were 10 cities over here in this area. One, Scythopolis, was across on the west side of the Jordan. The rest were on the east side of the Jordan. And they were cities that were built to be language, culture, location, and political status Greco-Roman. The Decapolis were centers of Greek and Roman culture in a region that was otherwise Jewish, Mr. Wikipedia said. And so I thought that was a pretty good explanation of it, even if it was Wikipedia. Mark is the only gospel that mentions the Decapolis, and he mentions it 3 times, and the last time is in 7 and verse 31, where we started our lesson this morning. This evening. It's this evening. I keep on getting my mornings and evenings mixed up. This is the theater at Scythopolis. This is ancient Beth Shan from the Old Testament. But in the Old Testament, there would not have been this theater. This was built in Roman times. So it's very impressive. I got to tour that while I was there. On the other side, this almost looks like the same picture, but it's completely on the other side of the Jordan, about 40 miles away from the first picture I showed you of a theater. This is the theater at Gadara. This is the theater at Gerasa. It's very impressive, or Gerasa, as it might be said. That's really a fancy stage down there, isn't it? Just imagine people watching. So when people acted in these plays, they wore these great big Greek masks, with features on them that were supposed to be expressive of who they were representing as they acted. And some of the masks were made so that they would actually magnify their voices, and the voices would carry. It's kind of like a megaphone thing as well. And the mask would work for that. But they were pretending to be somebody else. Then the pretending was full. They'd be in a big costume, with usually a big mask that was bigger than their head, and completely pretending to be something that they were not. And these people were all over the place, obviously, to act in these theaters. And it would be common knowledge, even if you were a Jew and hadn't been to a theater, you would have seen these folks and know all about this, I'm sure. Here's a Greek mask of Pan, the Greek god, who his sort of headquarters was not far from here, and we'll talk about that in the next lesson. But this was discovered at Hippos, which is one of the cities of the Decapolis. One of the archaeologists who discovered it is holding it up there and displaying it. You see how big the mask was and what we're saying about how that might play out, be used by actors. This is Dr. Michael Eisenberg from the University of Haifa that's holding that. And you see here some of the ruins of Hippos as well. Why am I showing you all of this? People have been playing the hypocrite for a long time. And the literal hypocrites, the actors that were wandering around all of these cities in Jesus' day, were a perfect illustration of the kind of people that the Pharisees and the Sadducees were. And every time Jesus uses the word hypocrite, if he's speaking Greek, and I think he is, that's what people would think of. These completely fake people. The hypocrites from the stage acting. There was a theater like this in Sepphoris. Sepphoris is not a town that you've probably heard of, but Jesus could see it from where he lived almost. It's 4 miles from Nazareth. He would have grown up around this kind of culture. This particular theater was originally built by Herod Antipas. It was later reconfigured and renovated in the 2nd century, I think. But you get the idea. This stuff was all over Galilee, all over the Decapolis. And Jesus is using a figure of speech that the people would have caught on to immediately and understood. All right. You have any thoughts or questions before we go on? Or before we quit, maybe I should say. All right. We'll stop there and pick up there Sunday morning. Thank you.
To me, one of the most beautiful passages in the New Testament is John chapter 1, those first 18 or so verses there. And we won't read all of that. But we'll begin in John chapter 1, beginning in verse 1, where it says, excuse me, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things were made through him, and without him nothing was made that was made. Jesus is the Word. He was with God, Jesus was with God, and Jesus is God. He's a very, very powerful being. Nothing was made. We weren't made without him. Jesus is God. But Jesus didn't demand that he keep that equality with God. And that takes us to Philippians chapter 2. Philippians chapter 2, we'll be reading verses 6 through 8. Even though he was God, he didn't demand to keep that equality with God. In Philippians chapter 2, verses 6 through 8, it says, who, talking about Jesus, being in the form of God, did not consider it robbery to be equal with God, but made himself of no reputation, taking the form of a bondservant, and coming in the likeness of men. And being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself and became obedient to the point of death, even the death of the cross. So even though he thought it not robbery to be equal with God or something to be held on to, I love the way that it says it here. It says that he humbled himself. He made himself of no reputation. He became obedient to the point of death, even the death of the cross. He is God, but he humbled himself. And he did this while he, as it says there, while he came in the likeness of men, as he was found in the appearance as a man. And so I want to go back to John chapter 1 again and read verse 14 that picks up that idea. John chapter 1 and verse 14, where it says, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. And we beheld his glory. The glory is of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. And what did he do while he was in this body, while he was humbling himself, while he was being obedient? Well, in verse 18, it says, no one has seen God at any time. The only begotten Son who is in the bosom of the Father, he has declared him. So Jesus has always been. He is God. He is powerful. He made everything that is. But he humbled himself. He became obedient. And he came here to show us who the Father is. How did he declare the Father? How did he show us who the Father is? Well, there's at least three different ways that I think we can say that he declared the Father. By the things that he said, by the actions that he performed, and by being submissive to the Father's will instead of his own will. There's a lot of verses that we could turn to that tell us about how he declared the Father in these ways. He declared the Father by the words that he used. In John chapter 12 and in verse 49, he says, for I have not spoken on my own authority, but the Father who sent me gave me a command what I should say and what I should speak. He is God, but he didn't come into his own authority. God, the Father, commanded him what to speak. And so in his humbleness and his humility and his obedience, he spoke what the Father told him to speak. Jesus declared the Father in the actions he performed. In John chapter 10 and verse 25, Jesus said, the works that I do in my Father's name, by my Father's authority, I am his representative by the things that I do. John chapter 18 and verse 11. You remember in John chapter 18, in this particular part, they have come after him in the garden, and they're about to take him away and, eventually crucify him. And Peter takes out his sword, as we talked about in class tonight, or at least was mentioned in class tonight, and he cuts off Malchus's ear. And Jesus says to him, put the sword up. Shall I not drink the cup which my Father has given me? This very, very, very hard cup to drink. This very, very, very hard situation to be in. This very, very, very hard thing to do. Shall I not drink that? Jesus showed who the Father was by the actions that he performed. He showed his obedience to him. And he showed and declared the Father by keeping the Father's will. In John chapter 6 and verse 38, he says, I came not to do my own will, but the will of him who sent me. Here he is God, but he's not doing his own will. He's doing the Father's will. John chapter 5 and in verse 30, he says, I can of myself do nothing. I do not seek my own will, but the Father's will. That's an outstanding statement to me. I can of myself do nothing. Here you are, you're the Creator, you're God, but you say of yourself you cannot do anything because he wasn't seeking his own will, but the Father's will. And in Matthew chapter 26 and in verse 39, a passage I'm sure that we're all familiar with, where Jesus was in the garden before they take him away, and he's praying to the Father, and he says, not as I will, but as you will. So we see from all of this that Jesus is God. He was always, just like God the Father was always. But he humbled himself, and he became obedient unto death. And he did that while he was amongst mankind. And while he was amongst mankind, he declared who the Father is by his words, by his actions, by giving in to the Father's will. The Bible refers to the followers of Jesus as Christians. So if we're truly Christians, then we'll be like Jesus. And isn't it at a very high level what a Christian is someone who humbles himself before the Father and before Jesus. And in their life, they declare who the Father is by their words, by their actions, by giving in to the Father's will instead of our own. We read Philippians chapter 2, verses 6 through 8, where it talked about Jesus thought it not robbery to be equal with God, but he humbled himself. What is the verse before that? Verse 5. Let this mind be in you, which was also in Christ Jesus. So if we're really Christians, we're going to have that same mind of humility, of obedience, of wanting to declare the Father in our lives. If there is anyone here tonight who wants to do that, who wants to humble themselves before the Father and declare their Father in their lives, we would love for you to come tonight and for you to be baptized into Christ. Or if anyone needs to come forward and repent of sin in their life that they have performed publicly, we would love for you to come while we stand and sing.